The year is 1899. The place, present-day South Africa. We find ourselves on the hill called Makersfontein, deep in the African steppe. Below us, 8,500 Boer troops are holding off 15,000 Boer troops. Artillery, machine guns, and modern weaponry fill the air with the sound of shells and bullets. The British troops found themselves charging across open ground at the break of dawn, facing an enemy that was prepared and unscathed by the pounding British artillery and well equipped for the fighting to come. With the light of dawn illuminating the battlefield, over 700 British troops die within the first 5 minutes of the battle, cut down by Boer rifles and machine guns. Before the day is over, many more will lay dead upon the slopes of Makersfontein. The Second Boer War, known more commonly as the Boer War, would become one of the great examples of modern warfare in its infancy. Machine guns, modern artillery, concentration camps, and guerrilla warfare would all feature in this cacophony of a war. When the war started in 1899, it was very traditional for the age. Large groups of men charging at each other to take this or that position, relying on bravery and the bayonet. By the time it was over in 1902, it had devolved into gritty ambushes, assassinations, and sabotage, which would make us think more of the Vietnam War than World War I. The war would see the British Empire first humiliated after a string of embarrassing defeats such as Makersfontein, and later redeemed as it moved hundreds of thousands of troops to South Africa to strangle any dreams of Boer independence. Why was South Africa so important to the British? Who were the Boers, and why did they fight the British? How did all of this happen? I hope to answer all of these questions on today's episode. This is the story of the Boers, the British, and the battle for the future of South Africa. I am Christian Callison. Look at the map of South Africa. And there, in the very center of the British possessions, like the stone in a peach, lies the great stretch of the two republics, a mighty domain for so small a people. How came they there? Who are these Teutonic folk who have buried so deeply into Africa? It is a twice-told tale, and yet it must be told once again if this story is to have even the most superficial of introductions. No one can know or appreciate the Boer who does not know his past, for he is what his past has made him. From The Great Boer War by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Welcome to my podcast. On this episode, we are going to try and explain the causes of the Second Boer War. Afterwards, we will take a short look at the consequences of this devastating war and how it impacted the empire. To understand how we got to the Battle of Makersfontein, we must go back to the start of British involvement in South Africa. Originally, European interest in South Africa was limited to the area we now know as Cape Town, at the very southern tip of Africa. Here, the Dutch East India Company established a small colony called the Kaapkolonie in 1652, which, as you can guess, translates to the Cape Colony. This town served as a base for ships to resupply on the long trip between Europe and Asia. This was of course before the Suez Canal cut the transport time down by months, which means that back then, if you wanted to sail from London or Amsterdam to the lucrative ports in the Far East, you'd have to sail all the way down the coast of Africa and pass the Cape. Such a trip would often take up to 6 months. Being a stopover point in the middle of this long and dangerous journey meant that the Cape Colony was quite important, despite it not being very profitable or powerful. The importance of the colony also caused more settlers to move there, and before long Dutch colonists began to settle not only the area around the Cape, but also the regions beyond it. These people would later be known as the Afrikaners, also known as the Boers. This period was also marked by conflicts between the newly arrived Dutch settlers and the Dutch East India Company, resulting in many colonists leaving behind the Cape Colony and emigrating into the vast South African steppes that were also known as the Welt. But infighting between the company and the colonists would be overshadowed by international events. The one that decided the fate of Dutch involvement in South Africa was the Napoleonic Wars that saw the colony ripped away from the Netherlands and transferred to the British Empire in 1814. From 1814 on, it was no longer called the Kaap Kolonie, but the Cape of Good Hope, or more simply, the Cape Colony. With the arrival of the British also came gradual societal change. In 1833, slavery was abolished in South Africa, which together with the imposition of English culture and language angered many of the Dutch settlers. The consequences of that being that many of the settlers decided to move away from the British-dominated Cape Colony and settle further inland. This became known as the Great Trek and resulted in the establishment of two brand new countries deep in the South African Veld. The South African Republic, also known more simply as Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. The story of the Great Trek went on to form the mindset of the Boer people, one of determined independence and rugged persistence. As we approach the second half of the 1800s, South Africa becomes a very divided place. The Boer republics and the Cape Colony all fight for more land and gradual expansion. This was both against each other, as well as against various African tribes in the area. From these conflicts evolved a sense of rivalry between the Boer republics and the British Cape Colony. For the Boers, it became important to expand into the empty spaces between the colonies so that they would be able to have a place for themselves and their kind. For the Cape Colony, the goal became keeping the Boer republics away from the sea so that they would remain dependent on the colony for international trade. All of this could have remained an issue only the locals cared about if it had not been for the discovery of a massive diamond field on the borders of the Transvaal, the Orange State, and the Cape Colony in 1867. This transformed the issues from small and simple regional issues to an issue worthy of imperial British attention. The discovery of massive gold and diamond deposits deep in the South African steppe transformed the landscape both literally and politically. Promises of massive profits created a gold rush that saw sudden massive immigration from all around the world. In very few years, this transformed the Boer republics from backwater farming communities to rich industrialized nations. With this transformation also came all new problems. We can divide these issues up into two easy-to-remember categories: the Uitlander issue and the political problem. The Uitlander term is used to describe the many, but mainly British immigrants that came to South Africa and flooded into the Boer republics. Uitlanders, or Outlanders in English, arrived to take part in the gold rush, but quickly found themselves being exploited for cheap labor. The gold and diamonds that had been discovered were just not accessible to the average miner. It required heavy investment and expensive machinery to access the deposits that were much deeper underground than any one miner could access. Despite of this, there had been a massive influx of workers, and these workers now found themselves living in cramped conditions around the biggest mines, earning a pitiful wage and worse, having absolutely no political rights. The Boer states, which consisted of the South African Republic, from now on simply Transvaal, which meant beyond the Vaal, which was one of the rivers crossed by the settlers, and the Orange Free State, had accepted the immigration back when it started, mostly because they did not have a choice. The exploitation of the new mineral wealth promised to fill the Boer coffers, but that would not be possible without a larger workforce. As such, immigrants were accepted into the Boer lands and allowed to work in the mines. However, the Boers had to make sure that even though the Uitlanders had the right to work, they would never have the right to vote. For the Boers who had emigrated from the Cape Colony to form their own nations in the South African Veld, the last thing they wanted to do was secede this independence and let themselves be dominated by British interests again. As such, voting laws in the Boer states demanded that you live on the territory for at least 14 years before you got any political rights, which effectively disenfranchised all of the Uitlanders. By doing this, they hoped to keep political control and remain separate from the British-controlled Cape Colony. This situation, however, also bred dissatisfaction among the Uitlanders that found themselves being discriminated against. This discrimination was not only political, but also social and economic, as the Uitlanders were treated as second-class citizens. In the social pyramid of the Boer republics, only the native blacks were below the Uitlanders, and as such, the Uitlanders found themselves often being targeted by Boer police and authorities. Uitlander schools were purposely underfunded, and infrastructure in Uitlander districts were medieval in comparison to the Boer areas, and death rates were as such much higher among the destitute Uitlander miners than among the Boer citizenry. This constant harassment and feeling of injustice caused great unrest among the Uitlanders, and the problem escalated from being a problem for the Boer governments and started attracting the attention of the British Empire. For the British, the Uitlanders' plight became an issue of national pride. The Uitlanders were British citizens abroad, and these citizens were being discriminated against. Newspapers in Britain often featured stories of these immigrants being harassed, beaten, and sometimes even killed in South Africa, which caused outrage at home. The British government increasingly saw themselves being drawn into defending the rights of the Uitlanders, as they found it impossible to ignore the petitions of the suppressed British citizens abroad. It became an issue of international prestige that Britain fix this Uitlander problem and protect her citizens abroad. For the Boers, the issue was equally as important. In Transvaal, the issue of political rights for Uitlanders had been a constant focus. To give the Uitlanders political franchise, that is, the right to vote, would lead to the complete collapse of Boer independence. The state of affairs was such that if the mainly British Uitlanders could vote for their own representatives, they would initially contest the native Boers in their parliaments, and eventually overwhelm them, and thus doom the Boers to once again becoming British subjects. The issue was of such critical importance that Paul Kruger, the president of Transvaal, was once quoted as saying, "You see that flag?" pointing to the flag of Transvaal. "If I grant franchise, I might as well pull it down." It was no wonder, then, that they resisted every diplomatic attempt by the British so far to change their laws and allow the Uitlanders to participate in the young republic. Beyond the plight of the Uitlanders also lay another aspect, the treatment of the native black Africans by the Boer states. As previously explained, the Boers considered the black natives to be the lowest rung of society, and they were treated as such. When the Boers had originally left the Cape Colony behind, one of the biggest issues had been that of slave owning. When the British had outlawed slavery in the colony, they had done so with the intention of recompensating the slave owners. However, the money that was set aside for this project was woefully lacking. This, among other issues, caused the trek that we talked about earlier. When the Boers then founded their own colonies deep in the veldt, they continued their slave-owning practices. They were later forced by the British to stop the practice, but Boer society had become instilled with the idea that the black race was below the white. This belief in racial superiority crept into everyday Boer life to such a degree that it disturbed British sensibilities. Natives were kept as apprentices and were forced to work for almost nothing on Boer farms. There was even an incident where a Boer president was gifted some apprentices, although he was quick to decline the present. Another noted example of this was a war fought between the Boers and a local tribe shortly before the Second Boer War, where the Boer military had used dynamite to trap large groups of black African natives in caves, leaving them to die of thirst, starvation, and insanity in the deep darkness. It is critical, however, not to overestimate the importance of this issue. Although the British liked to use the plight of the native Africans as one of their reasons for the war, they were not really interested in changing the status quo. Following the war, the peace treaty signed between the British and the Boer left the native Africans impoverished and without any rights. When forced to choose between keeping the white Boers happy and supporting the natives, the British much preferred the Boers, who they recognized as their white Christian brethren. Returning to the Uitlanders, championing their issues was not simply for humanitarian reasons. For the British government, it very quickly became an issue of empire and an issue that could be exploited. Hidden behind the official sentiment that intervention was necessary in the Boer republics lay the idea that by using the Uitlanders' plight, the Empire could manufacture a reason for war. Attempting to seize upon the Uitlander opportunity, the Cape Colony government organized an attempted coup of the Transvaal government in what is known as the Jameson Raid. To overthrow the Transvaal government, it was planned that a revolt of Uitlanders in the capital Johannesburg would take place, and then a group led by Leander Jameson, a colonial administrator, would cross the border with weapons and artillery and help the revolt overthrow the Boer government, which would then lead to Transvaal being incorporated into the Cape Colony. However, Jameson's group, consisting mostly of policemen from the neighboring British colony of Rhodesia, was tracked by the Boer military the moment it crossed the border, and eventually the group of would-be revolutionaries had to surrender. The incident was a massive fiasco for both the Cape government as well as the British Empire, as Britain was heavily criticized by the other great powers of the time, and the Boer Republic received much praise and support for fending off the British. Politically, the Boer Republic issue had grown steadily ever since the previously mentioned gold rush. Together with a smattering of small states, the previously mentioned republics made up the main Boer states. Formed in the crucible of war, these two backwater republics had been founded after Boer settlers had defeated the British during the First Boer War. The First Boer War had broken out due to Britain invading the Boer lands back in 1877. The Boers had grown resentful over having their sovereignty taken from them and revolted, eventually expelling the British troops in Transvaal and forcing the British to recognize them as independent republics. However, in return for this, the British were given the right to administer all Boer foreign politics, which effectively made them subjects of the British Empire. Yet with the discovery of gold and diamonds in the Boer republics, they had steadily grown independent of the British. They no longer needed the British to protect them, and they had started to administer their own affairs abroad. This also led the Boer republics to supplant the Cape Colony as the prime state in South Africa. For a long time, the British had hoped that the Cape Colony would grow so strong as to consume the smaller Boer republics. However, to the horror of the British officials, the opposite had happened. The economic boon of gold had made Transvaal a political and economic powerhouse in the region, drastically changing the delicate power balance. The British now feared that instead of the Cape Colony absorbing the Boers, the opposite would happen. The British often called this scenario the United States of South Africa, modeled on how the British lost their prize colony in North America. The only reason that the Cape Colony stayed somewhat important was its connection to the sea. With the way the railway net was built, the only way for the Boer republics to export and import was through the British Cape and via British shipping. This is what had previously dominated the relationship between the Boers and the British. However, with the Boers suddenly being more economically dominant, this relationship had changed. Suddenly, the republics were able to demand more out of the trade deals, and the Cape Colony found itself vulnerable. To lose the Cape Colony was unthinkable to the British. Whether it would be through some sort of Boer attack, or by the Cape Colony sliding into Boer control politically or just by economic necessity, it would be unthinkable to lose the Cape. Not only was it an important stopover point between Europe and Asia, if the Suez Canal was closed due to war, but conceding any sort of territory or power in South Africa could lead to Britain's rivals stepping in and exploiting the weakness. Specifically, Germany had long made its sympathies with the Boer republics known, and as such it was extremely important to quell the Boer problem before it became uncontrollable. Also pressuring the British government was the companies that ran the mines. Many, if not most of these companies, were run by British businessmen who had grown tired of the extensive taxation by the Boer republics. Especially the South African Republic, Transvaal, had extensively taxed the mining companies and used the money to fight a long series of border wars, as well as purchasing military equipment. If these mines were made part of British South Africa, they would see a decrease in taxes as well as less customs and other costs associated with exporting gold from the independent South African Republic to the British Cape Colony. This also feeds into a much broader story, a story of the British Empire and the boons of imperialism. Over time, the British had grown used to the idea of aggressive expansion for the good of the nation. For those in government at the time, it was even seen as a natural development, the strong dominating the weak and the necessity of acting before one's rivals. The Age of Empire had been a great time for the British public. Seen as a golden age for British culture and finance, It was largely built on the domination of many lands and peoples around the world. At home, the effects was also readily apparent. British industry thrived on exports to many of its colonies, owing to a series of laws and rules that meant that British colonies could only import industrial wares from their motherland. British weapons industry also boomed, helping the government construct the largest navy in the world and equipping its armies worldwide. Overall, empire was massively profitable for Britain. This profit, however, also began dictating policy. As already mentioned, the mining companies have become one of the many reasons that the British found South Africa worth its interest, and there was a fear that these companies could fall into Boer hands, and as such the profit would disappear from British coffers. Also, the profits of the Cape Colony were in danger. The Boers had for a long time sought their own access to the sea so they could avoid paying taxes and duties on trading with the rest of the world. However, if this became a reality, the basis for the Cape Colony would completely collapse. If it was to lose its monopoly as the only seaport in South Africa, then it would become nothing more than a naval base for the British ships instead of being the center of British South African operations. Economically, then, it made sense for Britain to consider the state of affairs in South Africa. If the Boers could be conquered diplomatically or through violence, Britain could not only halt the Boers who were ruining the delicate balance, but they could also secure the economic future of the colony. Having thoroughly discussed the many different reasons that Britain was interested in Boer affairs, it is finally time to connect all that we have learned to what actually happened. To finish this puzzle I have set out, we are now going to discuss the final weeks of peace before the Boer War broke out. Let us briefly summarize what has happened up till now. I explained to you how the Dutch settled the Cape Colony all the way back in the 1600s, followed by its loss to the British in 1814, and how this transfer caused a cultural schism between the British administrators and the Dutch settlers, who decided to move deeper into the South African wilderness to escape British control. In the veldt they built their own countries and skirmished with their neighbors for land. Here they raised livestock and tended to their farms, remaining largely a rural society. The Boer Republic seemed destined to remain irrelevant, but then gold and diamond deposits were found. This transformed the backwater, unindustrialized Boer nations into economic giants of the region. This transformation put them in a previously unthinkable position of power and made them rivals of the British Cape Colony instead of its dependent. In Transvaal, the injection of money from the mining districts had caused a burst in military spending. The backbone of the Boer armies had always been militia called commandos. These commandos were the farmers and cattle herders of the Boer lands that spent all their lives shooting for sport and for a living. They had become experts in traversing the veldt and knew the plains of South Africa like the back of their hand. What they lacked was modern equipment, and the Boer governments were more than happy to supply them. Huge sums of money were spent purchasing modern rifles, artillery, and a handful of machine guns. It was hoped that when the war came, these commandos would be able to hold off the British like they had during the First Boer War. And yes, the modern word for special forces, commandos, comes from the Boer term. With the arrival of these modern weapons, the confidence of the Boer republics grew, and they used this newfound income and equipment to wage war on their native neighbors. The Boer republics seemed destined to burst out of the limits imposed on them by the First Boer War, and become the dominant power in South Africa. The British nightmare of a United States of South Africa that would steal the Cape from them seemed like a reality. To stop this from happening, the British decided to act. The Jameson raid had been the original plan to stop the Boers, but now a different plan would be needed. A consortium of different British officials began plotting for the downfall of the Boer republics. The group included the Cape Colony Governor Alfred Milner, the British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain, and a group of the mine owners. They were all in agreement that the Boer republics needed to be stopped before they grew too big to be managed, and that Britain losing the Cape would be a great international embarrassment. So this consortium went ahead with planning a road to war. It was important to them that they were not perceived as the aggressors, because this could lead to international outrage. In essence, it would not be good for Britain's reputation if they were seen crushing small democracies abroad, especially republics inhabited by white Christians. So a good reason was needed to start a war that wouldn't cause international condemnation. The reason they chose was the previously mentioned plight of the Uitlanders. It was decided that they would force the Boers into negotiations regarding the political rights of the Uitlanders, and then they would present them with such outrageous demands that the Boers would withdraw from the talks. This then would enable the British to look like the reasonable and peace-seeking party and make their act of war justified. After the British Prime Minister had agreed to the terms, the plan was set in play. The British met the presidents of the Orange Free State and Transvaal and laid out their demands. The demands were straightforward. The Uitlanders were to be granted political rights after living in the country for 5 years, and the amount of seats in the Boer parliaments intended for the mining districts would be increased so that the Uitlanders would have more influence. The British then expected the Boers to be completely outraged and leave the negotiations, but they had underestimated their opponents. The president of Transvaal, the old and weary Paul Kruger, had expected a ruse and had heard reports of the British shipping more troops to South Africa, so he did the unexpected. He compromised. Kruger presented a plan that met the British halfway. 7 years instead of 15, and more seats for the Uitlanders in the Parliament. The compromise was not close enough for the British to consider, nor could they consider it. It included stipulations that would effectively make the Boer republics completely independent of British control, and while the years for political rights had been reduced, the rules surrounding these rights were so complex as to nullify any real political progress for the Uitlanders. But ultimately, if they accepted any compromise, they might lose their chance at a just war. The debate continued for a while. Several councils and meetings were had, telegraphs were exchanged, but the issue would not be resolved. The Boers were not willing to compromise their sovereignty, and the British were not willing to allow the Boers to prosper further. It was time for a war. And so, we have come to the end of the long road, past the Battle of the Pens and the wrangling of the tongues, to the arbitration of the Lee Metford and the Mauser. Penned by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Lee Metfords and Mausers were the rifles used by the British and the Boers. September 22, 1899, the Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain issues an ultimatum to the Boer states. They will have to accept the British terms, or there will be serious consequences. In return, the Boers issue their own ultimatum. They call for the British to withdraw all of the forces that have recently arrived in South Africa, turn around any ships on their way to South Africa, and accept that another power arbitrate between the British and the Boers. The British rejected the ultimatum, which then led to war. Although the British had planned for war, they were not prepared for it. The first part of the Second Boer War was a complete success for the Boers. Transvaal and the Orange Free State combined their armies and were able to outnumber and defeat the British. Makersfontein, Stormberg, and Colenso were the name of the 3 battlefields where the British lost, together forming what was dubbed the Black Week back in Britain. The British had completely underestimated what sort of force the Boers could muster, and the consequences was that they found themselves being besieged instead of besieging. The British reacted to these stunning defeats by flooding more troops into South Africa, which was eventually able to defeat the Boers, forcing them back into their own territory. What followed was a complete defeat of the Boer armies and a British takeover of both republics. Had the story ended there, then perhaps we would not be hearing of the Boers at all, but what followed was bloody, awful guerrilla warfare. The Boer soldiers that had survived the start of the war formed up together with the young and old and formed groups of fighters that spent the next couple of years fighting the British occupation of their lands. Striking at British supply lines and ambushing isolated British positions, the Boers were able to inflict considerable losses and forcing the British to change their tactics. The way the British attempted to halt these attacks were in the old manner. They had sent groups of soldiers out to find the Boers and defeat them in battles. However, the Boers were not willing to engage in such direct confrontations and instead slunk away into the savannah and waited for a better opportunity. To combat this, the British completely changed their strategy. What followed was an extensive campaign to limit the Boers fighters' freedom of movement and starve them out of hiding. The first step in this tactic was to remove the Boers' ability to resupply the guerrilla fighters, so they proceeded by burning down the scattered farmsteads, stealing the livestock, and burning the crops. Then, they took the occupants of those farms and sent them to concentration camps. It should be noted here that these are not the concentration camps of World War II. These were not dedicated extermination camps like the ones Jews and other political prisoners were sent to by Nazi Germany, but instead these camps had the goal of concentrating the Boers in guarded areas so they could not join or help the guerrillas. While these camps were not designed to kill their inhabitants, they often did. Overcrowded, understaffed, and lacking in essentials such as food and shelter, these camps became deadly to those who lived in them. Epidemics, starvation, and lack of sanitation killed a large number of Boer civilians. In all, 26,000 people died as a result of the concentration camps, with more dying outside of them as well. An additional 20,000 or so Boers were sent to be prisoners abroad in other British colonies. With the concentration camps and other anti-guerrilla warfare tactics, the British were able to quell the Boer fighters and force them to come to the negotiation table. Finally, in 1902, a peace was signed between the British and the guerrilla fighters who had kept at it since the very beginning. These were called the Bitter Enders, and with it, the Republic ceased to exist and were annexed by the British Empire. The war had been unbelievably costly, both in human lives and in expenses. The British had started the war expecting a quick victory, but ended up with more than 20,000 troops dead, while the Boers lost 14,000. The post-war peace agreement saw the British take over the Boer republics, but then later giving them self-rule and eventually incorporating them into the Union of South Africa in 1910. Although the war had been a bitter affair, the settlement between the British and the Boers was good enough that when a Boer rebellion broke out at the start of World War I, many of the leaders that had led the guerrilla fighters in the Boer War ended up leading the forces to crush the rebellion. The war had caused a crisis of faith in Britain, and it had only been with considerable financial and military effort that the Boers had been brought into line and the integrity of the empire restored. For the Boers, the result had been disastrous for the population, but ultimately the tough fighting had resulted in a peace that saw them regain importance and eventually becoming one of the dominant powers in South African politics, all the way up to the election of Nelson Mandela in the 1990s. Outside the scope of this podcast exists several other interesting discussions that this short analysis for the reasons of the war cannot discuss. The concentration camps could have easily been the focus of an entire podcast all by themselves, and the treatment of the native Africans by both sides also demands further discussion, which this podcast does not have time for. I hope this podcast has given you insight into why the Second Boer War started, and maybe also encourage you to read more about the war or the time period. This has been the story of why the Second Boer War started, and I am Christian Callison.